The Iron Wraith roared to life on a Tuesday morning in Ironwood, Montana. And then, 47 yards later, it died. Not a sputter, not a cough. A complete, silent, humiliating death in front of 4,000 witnesses, 3 television cameras, and every hardened mechanic who'd spent a career believing some machines were simply born wrong. But that's not the part that should scare you. The part that should scare you is what happened 4 days later, when an 18-year-old kid in a gas station uniform walked through a crowd of legends, crouched beside the most famous broken motorcycle in America, and said 7 words that nobody in that valley will ever forget. Stay with this story until the end. If something hits you, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Let's go. The cold arrived 3 days before the riders did. It came down from the Bitterroot Range without apology. A low gray pressure system that pushed the temperature into the low 20s and left frost on every surface it touched. The parking fields outside Ironwood, Montana were rutted frozen mud by Thursday morning. The vendors setting up along the main strip wore double layers under their jackets, and the coffee from the hospitality tent steamed so hard in the open air that it disappeared in seconds, like breath, like everything temporary in that valley. By Friday night, 1,100 motorcycles had already arrived. By Saturday dawn, the count was closer to 4,000. They came from Oregon and Idaho and Wyoming and places that don't have names on maps. Small communities built around gas stations and general stores, and the kind of quiet that sits in a man's chest like something he can't explain to anyone who didn't grow up in it. The Ironwood charity ride had been running for 22 years, and in that time it had become something larger than its own name. A gathering point, a reunion, a place where men who'd spent decades carrying things nobody else wanted to look at could stand together in the same cold and feel something close to ordinary. The Ironwood charity ride did not advertise itself as a spectacle, but this year, Ronan Mercer had made it one. Ronan was 61 years old and looked like a mountain that had survived several avalanches. 6'3", shoulders built from 30 years of engine work, and 2 combat deployments that he never discussed in polite company, with a gray beard trimmed close enough to suggest discipline and long enough to suggest he'd stopped caring about other people's comfort. He wore the same black riding jacket he'd owned since 1994, oil-stained at the cuffs, cracked at the collar, patched with the emblem of the Iron Sentinel Brotherhood on the left shoulder. A clenched fist wrapped in chain, simple and without decoration. The Iron Sentinels were not a club that recruited. They were a club that found people, specifically people who had nowhere else to go and something worth keeping inside them. Veterans, mostly. A few men who'd walked through the correctional system and come out quieter and more careful than when they went in. A handful of mechanics and welders and long-haul drivers who'd spent enough years alone on the road to understand that solitude was not the same as peace. They had no criminal enterprise. They had no territory dispute. What they had was a reputation built on 2 decades of showing up when other people didn't. Hospital runs, food deliveries, security for shelters that couldn't afford private protection, funerals for brothers who died with nobody else to stand at the grave. They were not gentle men, but they were not what people assumed when they saw the patches and the iron and the silence. Ronan had spent 10 years building the Iron Wraith, not as a hobby, not as a vanity project, as a statement about what it meant to understand a machine not as a collection of components, but as a single living system, every part in conversation with every other, nothing isolated, nothing irrelevant. He'd machined parts himself in the shop behind his house in Billings. He'd sourced the engine block from a 1978 shovelhead that he'd pulled from a barn outside Missoula, rebuilt it from the crank-up, and integrated it with a modern fuel delivery system that he'd spent 8 months designing and 3 months arguing about with engineers at a university in Seattle who eventually agreed with him but would never say so in writing. The Iron Wraith was not a beautiful motorcycle, in the way that show bikes are beautiful. It was beautiful the way a perfectly balanced knife is beautiful. Nothing unnecessary, nothing hidden, everything exactly where it needed to be for exactly the reason it needed to be there. He'd planned to ride it at the charity event. 1 public run. The proceeds going to the Veteran Transition Fund that the Iron Sentinels had been supporting for a decade. Then the bike would go on display, and after that, Ronan hadn't decided. Maybe keep it. Maybe donate it. Maybe something he hadn't thought of yet. He'd never considered the possibility that it wouldn't start. It started. That was the thing that made what happened next so incomprehensible. It started. Ronan had fired the engine in the pre-dawn cold while the crowd was still assembling, and the Iron Wraith had come alive with a sound that silenced 300 conversations simultaneously. Not a roar, a voice. Low, even. Deliberate. The kind of mechanical sound that sits in the sternum rather than the ears. Men who'd been riding for 40 years turned away from their coffee to look. Women who'd grown up around bikes their whole lives stopped mid-sentence. Even the camera operators from the 2 regional television stations that had come to cover the event pointed their equipment toward the sound before anyone told them to. Ronan had taken one slow lap of the staging area, unhurried, reading the machine through the handlebars the way he'd learned to read terrain in Fallujah, every vibration a sentence, and then brought it to the start position for the first official run. 47 yards. The Iron Wraith traveled 47 yards. Ronan would measure it himself, 3 times later, because the number felt like a punishment that deserved to be precise. And then it stopped. Not with drama, not with a warning light or a grinding sound, or even a hiccup. It simply ceased to function, as completely and suddenly as if someone had reached inside it and removed the concept of motion. The crowd didn't understand what they were seeing for the first 4 or 5 seconds. Then they did. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ronan had heard since a building collapsed in Ramadi in 2004. He sat on the motionless bike for a long moment, longer than he needed to, probably, but he needed that moment to exist before he moved through it. He could feel 4,000 pairs of eyes. He could feel the television cameras. He could feel the weight of 10 years pressing down through the seat and into his spine. He swung his leg over and stood up, and he did not look at anyone, and he wheeled the Iron Wraith back toward the repair area with both hands on the frame, walking it the way you walk an injured animal, carefully, without hurry, with the kind of controlled grief that doesn't leave room for theater. What happened over the next 4 days was something between a diagnostic exercise and a slow public humiliation. The first mechanics to look at the Iron Wraith were men Ronan had trusted for 20 years, iron sentinels who'd built bikes from scratch, who could identify engine problems by sound with the accuracy of surgeons. They found nothing wrong. Every system checked out. Every component was within spec. The fuel delivery was functioning. The ignition was clean. The engine turned over freely by hand. On paper, the Iron Wraith was not a broken motorcycle. It was a motorcycle that had, for reasons that could not be located or named, decided to stop. Then came the specialists. Ronan called in a favor from an engineer he knew in Missoula, a man who'd spent 30 years at the factory level and whose diagnostic opinion was considered close to final in every shop he'd ever walked into. That man spent 6 hours with the Iron Wraith on Saturday and left without a verdict, which was something that had apparently never happened to him before. A team from a performance tuning operation in Denver drove up Sunday morning and brought their own equipment, laptop diagnostic tools, oscilloscopes, fuel pressure analyzers, and spent the better part of 8 hours attached to the machine like surgeons performing a procedure they couldn't quite name. They found anomalies, small ones, barely worth noting individually, but nothing that should have caused the failure, nothing that explained the silence at 47 yards. By Sunday evening, the multi-million-dollar reward that Ronan had quietly authorized through the Iron Sentinel's attorney was drawing in specialists from further away. A retired aerospace engineer from Bozeman who did consulting work for motorcycle manufacturers. A fuel systems expert who'd flown in from California because the problem had been described to him in enough technical detail that he was genuinely curious. A mechanical engineering professor from the state university who arrived with 2 graduate students and a notepad filled with equations that ultimately pointed in directions that led nowhere. The media had gotten hold of the story by Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, the Ironwood charity ride had become something it was never designed to be. A national curiosity, a technical mystery, a story about the limits of expertise. Television segments ran under chyrons that said things like, "Legendary biker's decade-long project stumps the experts." The comment sections filled with theories. Online forums dedicated to vintage motorcycle restoration treated it as a philosophical puzzle. People who had never held a wrench in their lives had opinions. None of them fixed the iron wraith. Ronan moved through those 4 days with the controlled affect of a man managing something he would process later, privately, in a way that wouldn't require an audience. He spoke to the engineers with patience and precision. He answered the journalists with enough information to satisfy them and not enough to invite follow-up. He slept 4 hours a night in the trailer the Iron Sentinels had set up behind the main venue, and he drank his coffee black, and he did not show anyone the thing that was happening in the center of his chest, the slow, grinding recognition that the 10 years might have produced a machine he didn't fully understand. That possibility was not something he'd built a contingency for. It was Tuesday morning when the boy appeared. Ronan was standing outside the repair tent, third coffee of the day, going cold in his hand, watching another diagnostic session that he already knew wasn't going to produce anything new, when one of the Iron Sentinels, a man named Decker, broad and quiet and missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an incident nobody discussed, came and stood beside him. "There's a kid been hanging around the perimeter since yesterday," Decker said, without preamble. Ronan looked at him. 18, maybe 19. Came over from Hartfield. That's about 40 miles east. Works at the Sunridge station on Route 9. What does he want? To look at the bike. Ronan returned his gaze to the repair tent. So does everyone? He's not asking like everyone, Decker said. He's not asking like a fan. He's asking like someone who has something to say. That distinction landed differently than it would have 4 days earlier. Ronan turned it over for a moment. He set his coffee down on a crate. Bring him over. Talon Creed was built like someone who'd been doing physical work his entire life. Not large, but dense, with the kind of quiet physical efficiency that comes from years of labor rather than the gym. He wore a Sunridge auto service jacket over a gray thermal that had been washed enough times that the fabric had gone soft at the elbows and collar. His hands, when he extended one toward Ronan, were the hands of a mechanic. Not someone who wanted to be one, someone who was one. Grease worked into the creases of his knuckles in the way that doesn't come out in a single wash or even 3. He was 18 years old. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that looks like weather. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Talon," Decker said by way of introduction, and then stepped back, which was how Decker handled most things. Ronan looked at the boy for a long moment, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "You've been watching," he said, "since Sunday. You drive yourself up?" "Borrowed a truck." A pause. "Borrowed the gas money too, if we're being honest." Ronan almost smiled at that, which was something he hadn't done in 4 days. "What do you think you see?" Talon didn't answer immediately. He looked at the iron wraith, visible through the open side of the repair tent, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and the residue of expertise brought to its knees. He looked at it the way Ronan had come to recognize as meaningful, not with admiration, not with hunger, but with that careful lateral attention that belongs to people who understand systems rather than components. "Give me 2 minutes," Talon said. Ronan studied the boy's hands again, the grease, the steadiness. 2 minutes, he said, and stepped aside. What happened next happened quietly enough that the television cameras almost missed it. Talon walked to the iron wraith and stood beside it without touching it. He did not connect a diagnostic laptop. He did not pull out a pressure gauge. He walked slowly around the machine in a complete circle. Once, then a second time in the opposite direction. With his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes moving across every system in the way that a man reads a sentence, not word by word but in whole phrases, looking for the thing between the words. The bikers watching did not mock him. That was the thing Ronan would remember most clearly later. Not the boy's composure, not the silence of the crowd, but the specific quality of the attention the Iron Sentinels gave him. These were men who'd spent their lives detecting authenticity and its absence, men whose survival in difficult places had depended on that skill, and what they recognized in Talon Creed's stillness was not a performance. It was the real thing. Around him, the leather-clad brotherhood formed a loose perimeter, not deliberately, or maybe deliberately, but without discussion. Turning inward, facing the boy and the machine, shoulders squaring outward toward the cameras and the crowd. A wall without announcement. A circle of protection that nobody had called for and everybody had agreed to. Talon completed his second circuit and stopped at the left side of the engine. He crouched. He looked. Then he stood up and he said, quietly enough that only the men nearest to him could hear, "Nothing's broken." The repair tent went still in a different way than it had been still before. "4 things," Talon said, addressing Ronan now, directly, without theater. 4 tiny imperfections. None of them would matter alone. But they're in conversation with each other. Each one changes the behavior of the next one, and the 4th one multiplies the effect of all 3 of the others. Together, under exactly the right conditions, cold start, specific fuel load, RPM range, they stack into something that looks like total failure. But it's not failure. It's a relationship. Nobody spoke. Talon looked at the group of specialists who'd been working on the machine for 4 days. He didn't look at them with contempt. He looked at them with something that was almost apologetic. "You were looking for the broken thing," he said. "But there isn't one. You have to look at how the systems talk to each other." Ronan's oldest mechanic, a 68-year-old man named Briggs, who'd been working on engines since before Ronan was born, and who had never, in Ronan's experience, lowered his head in professional deference to anyone. Lowered his head. Outside, the snow that had been threatening since Monday finally arrived, coming down in slow, deliberate curtains across the Montana hills, as if the weather had decided this was the right moment to change. And Talon Creed picked up the first tool. His hands were completely steady, which was when Ronan Mercer, 61 years old, decorated veteran, founder of the Iron Sentinels, builder of the Iron Wraith, realized he was looking at something he had not planned for. Not a problem, not a solution, but a person, in the specific and irreplaceable sense of that word. A person who saw what trained eyes had missed. A person who carried knowledge built in a roadside garage in Hartfield, Montana, 40 miles east, where nobody had a diagnostic computer but everything got fixed anyway. What Ronan did not yet know, what none of them knew, standing in the snow-hushed quiet of that repair tent while the cameras pressed against the perimeter and the Iron Sentinels stood in their silent circle, was that Talon Creed had not slept in 36 hours, that the truck he'd borrowed belonged to a man he owed money to, and that in the left pocket of his Sunridge jacket, folded into a square so small it was barely visible, was an engineering school acceptance letter dated 14 months ago that he had never been able to act on. And that was the detail. That single piece of paper in a worn jacket pocket that was about to change everything. Talon's first tool contact with the Iron Wraith lasted exactly 11 seconds. That was how long it took him to remove a single access panel on the left side of the engine block. 4 screws, quarter turn each, practiced hands moving without hesitation, and exposed the fuel delivery manifold underneath. He set the screws in a line on a clean rag he'd pulled from his jacket pocket, spacing them with a precision that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with habit. The kind of habit that gets built in a garage where losing a small part means a customer waits another week. Ronan watched from 5 feet back. He'd made a decision, somewhere in the space between Talon's second sentence and the first tool movement, to give the boy the room he asked for without crowding it. That decision cost him something. Ronan was not a man accustomed to stepping back from his own machine, but he made it because the alternative was to let his own ego be the thing that kept the Iron Wraith broken. And that was a worse outcome than the discomfort of watching a stranger work. Decker stood beside Ronan, arms folded. He smelled like cigarette smoke and cold air, which was how Decker always smelled, in every season, in every situation. He had not said anything since he'd introduced the boy. He didn't need to. His presence said what it needed to say. Behind them, the Iron Sentinels who'd been maintaining the perimeter shifted incrementally, drawing the circle tighter without making it smaller, a compression of attention rather than space. Their collective silence had a texture now, something between vigilance and the specific held breath quality of men who've learned to watch the thing that everyone else has stopped watching. Talon moved to the right side of the engine. His eyes hadn't left the machine since he'd picked up the screwdriver, but he wasn't looking at what he'd uncovered. He was looking at what sat next to it, the fuel pressure regulator housing, which was original to the 1978 block and which every specialist had either cleared or ignored in the preceding 4 days. He crouched again. His lips moved slightly, not speaking, the micro-articulation of a mind working through something complex in silence. "The regulator housing," he said without looking up. Ronan waited. "It was machined to original 1978 spec?" "Yes." "And your fuel delivery system is the modified modern setup?" "Correct." Talon was quiet for a moment. "So when the temperature drops below 22 degrees and the fuel viscosity shifts at cold start, the pressure differential between the two systems is slightly outside the original housing's tolerance range." He paused. "Not enough to trigger a fault, not enough to show on a diagnostic, but enough to cause a micro-hesitation in the injector cycle." Ronan said nothing. "That micro-hesitation," Talon continued, "causes the ignition timing module, the aftermarket one, the one on the right housing, to compensate by advancing the timing 1.4 degrees, which it's designed to do. But the air intake valve on this specific block opens 0.3 seconds earlier than modern spec because of the way you rebuilt the cam profile." He finally looked up. His face was completely neutral. "So you have a 1.4 degree timing advance meeting an early open intake cycle, which creates a lean condition at exactly the RPM range you were in when the bike stopped. And under sustained lean condition, the ECU's last generation overflow protocol shuts the system down to prevent damage." He stood. "The ECU doesn't log it as a failure because, from its perspective, it performed correctly. It was protecting the engine." The repair tent held its silence for a long 3 seconds. Then Briggs, 68 years old, who had been standing at the back of the group with his hands in the pockets of his vest and his eyes on the floor, said one word: "Hell." Not as an expletive, as a verdict. Ronan looked at the machine. He looked at it differently than he had a minute ago. Not with the grief of a man confronting failure, but with the specific, difficult quality of a man confronting a mistake he made with full competence and full knowledge, which is the worst kind of mistake, because it leaves no room for excuse. He had designed that cam profile himself. He had made a conscious decision about the rebuild. He simply had not traced the downstream consequences of that decision through every system the machine contained. He had looked for broken parts too, just like everyone else. "What do you need?" Ronan said. Talon reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper. He unfolded it on the workbench. A hand-drawn schematic, pencil on the back of a gas station receipt, with 4 numbered points and connecting lines between them. The lines had arrows. He'd drawn it while watching from the perimeter. "These 4 adjustments," Talon said, "in this sequence." Ronan studied the schematic. His jaw worked slightly. Beside him, he heard Decker exhale. Not a sigh, just a slow breath through the nose, the sound of a man recalibrating. "Start with the regulator housing," Talon said, and picked up the next tool. The snow outside was thickening now. It came against the sides of the repair tent in irregular gusts, and somewhere in the near distance, a line of Harleys that had been idling through the ceremony program cut their engines almost simultaneously, the sudden silence from outside landing on the repair tent like a dropped weight. In that stillness, the only sounds were the metallic precision of Talon's tools and the occasional pop of the propane heater in the corner and the breathing of the men watching. 40 minutes later, Talon set down the last tool. He stepped back from the iron wraith and looked at it with the same lateral attention he'd used at the beginning, reading the whole, not the parts. He wiped his hands on the rag. He folded the rag. He put it back in his jacket pocket. "Try it," he said. Ronan walked to the motorcycle. He swung his leg over with the practiced ease of a man who'd mounted bikes for 40 years. He settled his weight. He put his hand on the ignition. The iron wraith fired on the first turn. Not a cough. Not a struggle. A clean, immediate, authoritative ignition. That same low voice they'd heard 4 days ago on the first start. The same chest-deep mechanical presence, but now without the subtle hesitation underneath it that nobody had consciously noticed because it had been too small to name. Now that it was gone, the absence was louder than the original sound had been. The engine idled at exactly the RPM it should have idled at, steady as a heartbeat, and it stayed there. Nobody cheered. The silence lasted 1 full unrepeatable heartbeat. The kind of moment that doesn't announce itself as memorable while it's happening, but that every person in that tent would find themselves returning to for the rest of their lives, in the space before sleep, on long drives, in the particular quiet of a winter morning when the brain moves slowly and finds the things it actually kept. Then the tent erupted, but Talon had already turned away. He was standing at the workbench, reorganizing his tools, the three he'd borrowed from the repair kit arranged back in the order he'd found them. His shoulders were slightly forward, the posture of a man who has absorbed a significant thing and is in the process of deciding what to do with it. His hands had stopped being completely steady, Ronan noticed. Not from nerves. From the drop of adrenaline that follows sustained concentration, the body remembering it had been holding itself carefully for 40 minutes. Ronan cut the engine. The tent found a different kind of quiet. He walked to the workbench. He stood beside the boy, not across from him, which was a choice. He picked up his cold coffee and drank from it without looking at Talon. "How did you know it would be those 4 things?" Ronan said. Not a question. Not quite. Talon was quiet for a moment. "I didn't," he said. "I knew it would be something about the relationship between the original components and the modern systems. That was the only explanation that fit the symptom profile. So I started from that assumption and looked for the specific version of it. You've done this before. Different machines, same approach." Ronan set his coffee down. He turned to look at the boy for the first time since the repair had begun, fully the way he looked at men he was deciding something about. "Where did you learn to think that way?" The slight shift in Talon's jaw was barely visible. A compression, a consideration, something being weighed. "My father," he said. "He had a garage in Hartfield. We didn't have diagnostic equipment, so we had to think instead." Had. Past tense. Ronan heard it. He let it sit. "What's in your left pocket?" Ronan said. Talon looked at him. "You've touched it 3 times since you started working. People touch things they're carrying when they're under pressure." The tent had mostly emptied, the specialists drifting out, the journalists converging on the iron wraith from a respectful distance, Decker managing them with his particular blend of courtesy and immovability. The 2 of them were effectively alone at the workbench now, which was something that had happened without planning and felt, in the way some moments feel, like it had been waiting to happen. Talon reached into his left jacket pocket and produced the folded square of paper. Not the schematic, a different piece. He set it on the workbench between them. Ronan looked at it without touching it. The fold lines were worn, the creases soft from repeated handling. It had been opened and closed many times. "Engineering school," Ronan said. "Montana State." Talon's voice was flat. 14 months ago." "What happened?" "Tuition happened." A pause. "My father had his first stroke in August of that year, second one in November. Shop closed. I went to work at Sunridge." He picked the letter back up, folded it back into its square, replaced it in his pocket. The movement was automatic, the gesture of returning something to its designated place. "I still look at it sometimes. Old habit." Ronan was quiet. Outside, through the tent wall, the sound of engines had begun again. The charity ride was resuming around the Iron Wraith's resurrection, life reorganizing itself around the event that had just occurred. He could hear the crowd noise, the announcer's voice, the particular full-body sound that several thousand Harleys make when they're running together in cold air. He'd been waiting for that sound for 4 days. He barely heard it. "Stay tonight," Ronan said. Talon looked at him. "Not asking you to commit to anything. Stay tonight. Eat with the Brotherhood. Sleep somewhere that isn't a truck cab." He picked up his coffee again. "We'll talk in the morning." Talon said nothing for a moment, then, "The truck I borrowed, I need to return it. Decker will arrange for someone to run it back. I owe money on the gas." "Decker will arrange that too." Another silence. Talon looked toward the Iron Wraith, visible now through the open tent wall, surrounded by the careful attention of the iron sentinels who'd resumed their perimeter. Not for the machine now, but out of habit, the instinct to protect what mattered in the general vicinity. He looked at the machine with something that wasn't quite longing and wasn't quite grief, and was probably some mixture of both that didn't have a name in easy language. "Okay," he said, and that was the first thing he agreed to. The trouble started before dinner. It didn't announce itself as trouble. It rarely did in the Iron Sentinels, where most of the significant conflicts began in the space between what was said and what was meant, in the pauses of conversations that seemed ordinary until they weren't. The Iron Sentinels had a process for decisions, not democratic exactly, not hierarchical exactly, but something that functioned like a combination of both, where Ronan's voice carried the most weight, and the weight of experience around him shaped what that voice decided. That process had worked for 19 years. It started showing its stress fractures around 7 o'clock, in the back room of the Ironwood Roadhouse, where the Brotherhood had pushed 4 tables together and occupied the corner the way they occupied corners, with their backs to the wall and their faces to the room, and the particular spatial awareness of men who've learned to never be surprised from behind. Talon sat at the end of the table. He'd been given an Iron Sentinel's hoodie by someone. He wore it over his Sunridge jacket, which he hadn't taken off, which told Ronan something about a young man who was accepting hospitality while keeping his own identity visible underneath it. He ate with the focused attention of someone who hadn't eaten adequately in a while and was managing the response to a real meal with the discipline of not showing it too obviously. He spoke when spoken to. He didn't perform. The first crack was Garrett. Garrett Cross was 44 years old and had been with the Iron Sentinels for 11 years, since Ronan had pulled him out of a Veterans Administration waiting room in Helena, where he'd been sitting for 6 hours waiting to see a counselor about something he never fully disclosed, even to the Brotherhood. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had the particular brand of hypervigilance that comes back from that experience in some men. A constant low-level threat assessment, eyes always moving, conversations always being weighed for subtext, trust extended carefully and retracted fast. He was one of the Iron Sentinel's best riders and one of the most reliable men in a crisis. He was also the first one to say what several men in that room were thinking but hadn't said yet. He said it to Ronan in the hallway outside the bathrooms, between the main dining room and the back corridor where the staff stored supply boxes. Not chosen for privacy, they'd both ended up there at the same time, which was the kind of coincidence that sometimes isn't. "You're going to offer him something," Garrett said. Flat. Not a question. "I'm going to talk to him in the morning," Ronan said. "That's not what I asked." Ronan looked at him. "No, it's not." The hallway was narrow and smelled like industrial cleaner and the residue of decades of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the walls before the smoking ban. A single bulb above them, uncovered, casting downward light that wasn't kind to either face. "He's a kid we met 3 hours ago," Garrett said. "He fixed the Iron Wraith." "I know what he did. I was standing there." "Then what's the problem?" Garrett's jaw shifted. He looked at the wall for a moment, then back. "The problem is you're already looking at him the way you look at people when you've decided something. And we haven't had a conversation. You haven't asked anyone. You're just—" He stopped. Reorganized. "It's fast, Ronan. Even for you." "Noted," Ronan said. "That's not—" Garrett's voice dropped a register, not in volume, but in register. The specific compression of a man keeping himself level on a topic he feels with more force than he's showing. "That's not what I mean, and you know it. I'm not talking about procedure. I'm talking about, we don't know this kid. We don't know what he's carrying. We don't know who he's connected to. And you're ready to bring him in because he's good with engines." "He's extraordinary with engines." "Lots of people are good at things." A pause that had weight in it. "We were all good at something once." Ronan held the look for a moment. He understood what Garrett was actually saying, so not the surface words, which were about caution and process, but the sentence underneath, which was about what it costs a man to be brought into something, to start trusting a framework again, and what happens when that framework disappoints him. Garrett knew what that cost was. He'd paid it somewhere before the Iron Sentinels, in ways he'd never fully disclosed. "I hear you," Ronan said, and he meant it. "But you're going to do it anyway," Garrett said. Ronan didn't answer, which was its own answer. Garrett looked at the wall again. He nodded once, not agreement, acceptance, which was different. Then he walked back into the dining room, and Ronan stood in the hallway alone for a moment longer than he needed to, his hand on the wall, feeling the cold come through from outside. He thought about the acceptance letter in Talon's pocket, the soft fold lines, the way the boy had returned it without drama, like he returned it 100 times a day without drama. He pushed off the wall and went back to the table. The second crack was wider. It came the next morning before breakfast, in the parking area behind the roadhouse where the Iron Sentinels had staged their bikes overnight. 8 of them standing in a loose configuration that wasn't a meeting and was absolutely a meeting in the way the Brotherhood communicated. Physically present in the same space, nominally doing something else, actually doing the thing they'd gathered to do. Ronan came around the corner and read the configuration before anyone spoke. He slowed but didn't stop, crossing to his own bike and opening the saddlebag with deliberate calm. It was Briggs who spoke. Old Briggs, whose verdict the previous day had been the most authoritative thing said in that repair tent. "I owe the kid an honest accounting," Briggs said. His voice was rough from decades of cigarettes and his particular brand of early morning. "What he did yesterday. That's something. That's real. Nobody's saying otherwise." Nobody said anything. That was how Briggs was heard, in the space before the butt. "But Ronan," he continued, "what you're building in your head right now, I've watched you build it. I know what it looks like from the outside. And I need you to hear me when I tell you that a 16-hour relationship is not a foundation." "He's 18, Ronan said. "That's exactly the problem. Briggs, he's 18 and he's got nothing, and he's extraordinary at something, and you want to fix that. I know. I know you. That's why you started this whole thing 19 years ago, because you saw something worth protecting and you acted on it." Briggs pulled a cigarette from behind his ear and held it without lighting it, turning it between 2 fingers. "But there are 37 men in this brotherhood who you made that same commitment to over time, with history, with proof. And this kid doesn't have any of that yet, and you're about to hand him something in front of all of them." The morning was cold and getting colder. Gray sky above the parking area, a few flakes drifting without direction. The Harleys were covered in a thin layer of frost that caught the weak early light and held it. "What do you want from me?" Ronan said. "I want you to slow down," Briggs said. "That's all. Just slow down." "I've been slow my whole life," Ronan said, "and I've watched things I was slow about disappear." He closed the saddlebag. "I'm going to talk to the boy this morning. I'm going to tell him what I'm thinking, and then I'm going to bring it to the Brotherhood before anything is decided. That's the process, and I'll follow the process." Briggs lit the cigarette. "That's fair," he said. But something in the morning air, in the way the other men dispersed without looking at Ronan, in the way the smoke from Briggs's cigarette moved sideways in the wind before it rose, told Ronan that fair was not the same as resolved. He found Talon at the diner across the street at 7:15. The boy was already there when Ronan arrived, sitting in the last booth with a cup of coffee that had gone half cold, turned sideways so he could see the window and the door simultaneously. The same threat assessment seating that Ronan used, the same configuration that Garrett and Decker and Briggs all defaulted to without thinking about it. Walls at the back, sight lines to all entries. He'd picked it up somewhere. The father's garage, maybe, or something else. Something Ronan hadn't learned yet. The diner smelled like coffee and fried oil and warm air meeting cold, the heater working hard against the morning outside. A few truckers at the counter, the faint sound of a radio from the kitchen, country station, boots on linoleum. Ronan slid into the opposite side of the booth. The waitress came and he ordered coffee without looking at the menu. "How'd you sleep?" he said. "Fine," Talon said, which meant something between fine and not at all, which was the only answer a person gives to that question when they're in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people and their nervous system doesn't fully understand that it's safe to relax. "I want to tell you something," Ronan said, "and I want you to hear it before you respond, because the responding part is less important right now than the hearing part." Talon set his coffee cup down. His hands returned to the table, palms down. Listening posture. "What you did yesterday," Ronan said, "wasn't fixing a motorcycle. I know that's what it looked like. But what you actually did was demonstrate a way of thinking that I have not encountered in 4 decades of working with machines, in 20 years of working with some of the most capable mechanics alive at that level, and someone your age. Or any age." Talon said nothing. "The engineers who looked at that bike spent 4 days with it. They had equipment worth more than this building, and they couldn't locate the problem because they were looking for broken things, and you were right. There weren't any. You looked at the system. That's a different skill. That's not something you teach in a diagnostics class. Ronan picked up his coffee. Where did your father teach you that? A long pause. Long enough that the waitress came and went without either of them noticing. He didn't teach it, Talon said finally. He'd talk through problems out loud while we were working. And the way he talked through them, it was always about what one thing was doing to another thing. He never said, this part is broken. He said, this part isn't talking to that part the way it should. A pause. I didn't know that was different until I started working at Sunridge and realized the other mechanics didn't think that way. What happened to your father? Ronan said. Still, quiet. The question given room. The diner radio shifted songs. Someone at the counter laughed at something and then stopped. Outside, a truck engine turned over and caught, pulling away from the parking lot. 2 strokes, Talon said. 14 months apart. He's in a care facility in Hartfield now. He can walk, but he doesn't... A stop. A recalibration, visible in the way his jaw moved. He doesn't recognize me most of the time. He'll have a few hours where it comes back, and then it goes again. Ronan let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. The garage, Talon said, was in his name, and it had a mortgage on it. I tried to keep it going for 4 months after the second stroke. But I was 18 and I had no credit, and the bank they weren't interested in extending goodwill to someone my age. So it went. He picked up his coffee. Sunridge hired me the same week. Ronan said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the table. He looked at the window, at the cold Montana street outside, at the frost on the glass that was beginning to clear where the diner's warmth reached it. I want to offer you something, he said. Not a handout. Not the reward money, though that's yours regardless. Something different. Talon waited. The Iron Sentinels have been talking about building a vocational academy, hands-on mechanical training, specifically for young people who have the aptitude but not the access. We have the land. There's a property outside Billings that's been sitting for 3 years waiting for the right purpose. We have the funding, partially, from the charity ride proceeds and some long-term donors. What we don't have is someone who can design the curriculum in a way that actually teaches mechanics to think about systems rather than components. Ronan looked at him. And we don't have someone who can do that while also being a student themselves, while also attending engineering school, which the fellowship we'd be offering would cover. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had a different weight, a different temperature. You're talking about, Talon started. A partnership, Ronan said. You help build the program. The program supports your education, and the Brotherhood stands behind both. He paused. I won't pretend it's simple. There are men in my Brotherhood who don't know you and who have reasons, good reasons, not to extend trust quickly. That process takes time. This conversation is the beginning of a much longer one. Talon's hands, palms down on the table, were completely still. Why? He said. One word, not ungrateful, genuinely interrogative. Because you looked at the Iron Wraith and you saw relationships instead of parts, Ronan said, and I've spent 19 years trying to build a brotherhood on exactly that principle, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Outside, the sound of Harley engines began to build as the Iron Sentinels started arriving at the diner for breakfast. The deep, overlapping rumble of several machines, coming from the direction of the roadhouse, growing steadily. The familiar sound of men Ronan had ridden beside for 2 decades. Talon turned to look out the window. He watched the bikes pull into the lot across the street. His expression was unreadable in the way that 18-year-old faces are unreadable when they're managing something enormous. I need to think about it, he said. That's the only right answer, Ronan said. What neither of them knew, what Ronan would not know for another 3 hours, until Decker came to find him at the table with his phone in his hand and his face arranged in the expression Decker wore when the information was significant and bad, was that someone had already been making decisions about Talon Creed before Ronan finished his coffee. The phone call had come into the Iron Sentinel's legal contact at 8:47 that morning, while Ronan and Talon were still talking in the diner. It came from an attorney in Billings who represented a holding company whose name appeared in no public filings and whose interest in Ironwood, Montana, had begun approximately 72 hours earlier, the moment the first television segment about the Iron Wraith failure went to air. The attorney had asked, with the careful neutrality of someone reading from prepared language, whether Ronan Mercer intended to make a public announcement about the young man who had repaired the motorcycle, whether Ronan intended to formalize any agreement, whether the young man had legal representation. And then, in the specific phrasing that Decker repeated to Ronan verbatim, because Decker was the kind of man who understood that exact words mattered, whether Ronan was aware that the Sunridge Auto Service Station, where Talon Creed was employed, had an outstanding liability claim related to a vehicle repair performed 8 months ago, and that the individual who'd filed that claim had substantial resources and an interest in ensuring that any public elevation of Talon Creed's profile came with the appropriate legal context. Decker stood at the end of the table with his phone in his hand and read it off the screen. Ronan set down his coffee cup. The ceramic made a sound against the table that was small and definite and final, in the way that small sounds sometimes are when something shifts underneath a conversation. He looked at Talon across the table, at the boy who had folded an acceptance letter into a square small enough to carry in his jacket pocket for 14 months and hadn't thrown it away, who had borrowed a truck and 40 miles of gas money to look at a motorcycle that nobody else could fix, and had driven back into his ordinary life after being told he'd saved something legendary, who was sitting in a diner in Ironwood, Montana, deciding whether to trust a man he'd known for less than 24 hours, and something, had already moved against him, before the offer was even made, before Talon had said yes or no, before he'd had the chance to do anything except be extraordinary at the wrong moment in front of the wrong people. Ronan looked at Decker. "Who filed the claim?" he said. Decker's face said what his voice was about to confirm. The name he said next was one that Ronan had not heard in 11 years. Not since a business deal gone cold. Not since a conversation in a different diner in a different city that had ended with two men deciding, quietly and permanently, to stay out of each other's way. A man who kept his promises. A man who did not forgive debts. A man whose holding company had fingers in automotive liability litigation across 6 western states, and who had no reason whatsoever to be interested in an 18-year-old gas station mechanic from Hartfield, Montana, unless the 18-year-old had fixed something that the man had been quietly, carefully, and very privately paying specialists to keep broken. Ronan's hand, resting on the table beside his coffee cup, closed slowly into a fist. Outside, the Harleys idled in the cold parking lot, and the sound of them was no longer just the sound of his brotherhood. It was the sound of something that was about to be tested in a way that none of them had seen. The name Decker said was Vincent Carlo. Ronan didn't move for 3 full seconds. He sat with both hands on the table, and his coffee going cold between them and the diner noise continuing around him. The truckers at the counter, the radio from the kitchen, the sound of boots on linoleum. All of it continuing in the way that ordinary things continue when something fundamental has just shifted underneath them. Then he said, "Say it again." Decker said it again. Talon was watching Ronan's face. He was perceptive enough to understand that whatever had just been communicated across the table was significant, and disciplined enough not to ask about it yet. He sat with his coffee and waited, which was the right call, and Ronan noted it the way he noted everything useful, filed, without comment. "Step outside," Ronan said to Decker. To Talon, "Stay here. Order breakfast. Put it on the Brotherhood account." He paused at the edge of the booth. "Don't go anywhere." Talon looked at him steadily. "I don't have anywhere to go." Which was true, and also a sentence with more weight in it than its surface meaning, and Ronan carried it out into the cold with him. The morning air hit hard. 20 degrees, a thin wind coming off the range, the sky the color of old concrete. Decker was already around the side of the building, away from the front windows, in the narrow passage between the diner and the laundromat next door, where a single ventilation unit pushed warm air out into the gap and made it fractionally more bearable. He had another cigarette going. He'd smoked more since they arrived in Ironwood than he typically did in a week. "Tell me everything," Ronan said. "Everything the attorney said, word for word." Decker told him. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Decker had recorded it. This was standard Iron Sentinels protocol for any unsolicited legal contact, established after an incident 6 years ago that nobody discussed in detail, but that had resulted in a comprehensive communications policy. The attorney, whose name was Sutton, had been precise and pleasant in the particular way of men who carry bad news for a living and have learned to deliver it without the delivery being the memorable part. He'd established the holding company's interest. A company called Crestfield Automotive Consulting, LLC, registered in Nevada, operating across Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. He'd referenced the liability claim against Sunridge Auto Service, a vehicle repair that allegedly resulted in brake failure on a 2019 pickup truck belonging to a man named Gerald Parr, who'd filed the claim 8 months ago and had been represented through it by Sutton's firm. Gerald Parr, Ronan said. You know him? No. Ronan was quiet for a moment. But Crestfield Automotive Consulting is Carlo's shell. Third or fourth layer out from his holding company. He restructured after the SEC looked at him in 2019, broke everything into regional LLCs with no visible connection. He looked at the wall. I know, because I had our attorney review his structure when we were considering the Billings property. We wanted to know who was operating in that market. Decker pulled on his cigarette. So Carlo owns the liability claim against the kid's employer. He owns the firm that filed it, which means he controls the timeline, the settlement terms, and the public record of the claim. Ronan's voice was flat. If he wants to make Talon Creed's name toxic in any professional context, if he wants to ensure that no engineering program, no legitimate employer, no partnership of any kind can associate with that kid without inheriting the liability narrative, he has the mechanism to do it. Why? Decker said. What's Carlo's interest in an 18-year-old mechanic from Hartfield? Ronan looked at him. The Iron Wraith was broken, Ronan said slowly, for 4 days, in front of national media coverage, with a multi-million-dollar reward on the table, and every specialist in the country couldn't find the problem. Decker's cigarette stopped moving. Carlo has automotive consulting operations in 6 states, Ronan continued. His business model is built on diagnostic authority. His people go into shops, dealerships, fleet operations, and they provide the expert assessment that determines how money moves. Insurance claims, liability determinations, repair cost validation. He paused. If an 18-year-old kid with no credentials and no equipment solves a problem publicly that broke every credentialed expert in America, what does that do to the market value of expertise? The ventilation unit cycled up and pushed a gust of warm air between them, and then cycled down again, and the cold came back. It undermines it, Decker said. It doesn't just undermine it. It reframes the entire argument for why credentialed diagnostic expertise is worth paying for. Because the story that runs, the story that's already running on television, online, in the forums, is not, here's an anomalous case. It's, the expert spent 4 days failing, and a gas station kid with dirty hands solved it in 40 minutes. That's the story. That's the only story anyone's telling. Ronan looked at the concrete wall of the laundromat. Carlo can't untell it, but he can bury the kid before the kid becomes a platform for it. Silence. He was already watching the event, Decker said, before it happened. Or he made something happen at the event, Ronan said, and now the outcome wasn't what he planned. That sentence landed in the narrow passage between the buildings like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward from it in directions neither of them wanted to follow immediately. Decker's cigarette burned to the filter and he dropped it and crushed it under his boot without looking down, his eyes on Ronan. You think the bike? I don't know, Ronan said. I don't know yet. He pushed off the wall. Get me Marcus. I need him to pull everything on Crestfield's Nevada registration, the liability claim, and the event permit applications for Ironwood going back 2 years, and I need him to do it before anyone outside this conversation knows we're looking. Marcus was the Iron Sentinel's 3rd member, and their most functionally invisible, a former intelligence analyst who'd left the Army after 12 years with a disability rating and a particular set of skills that had never been formally acknowledged and that the Brotherhood had been making careful use of for a decade. He was currently in the main roadhouse, eating eggs. On it, Decker said, and was already moving. Ronan stood in the passage alone for a moment. The wind found the gap between buildings and came through it with authority. He turned his collar up. He looked at his own hands. 61 years of them, cracked at the knuckles, grease lines in the creases that never fully came out. He thought about a cam profile he'd designed himself, a deliberate decision made with full competence, whose downstream consequences he hadn't fully traced. He went back inside. Talon had ordered. He was working through eggs and toast with the focused energy of a young man's metabolism and the careful table manners of someone who'd grown up without much but had been taught to be respectful of what there was. He looked up when Ronan slid back into the booth but didn't ask the question directly. "Someone's interested in you," Ronan said, because the boy deserved the direct version. "Someone with resources. They have a legal mechanism pointed at your employment record that they can use to complicate your professional life if you become publicly associated with what happened yesterday." Talon set down his fork. He was quiet. "Do you know a man named Vincent Carlo?" Ronan said. "No." "Do you know a company called Crestfield Automotive Consulting?" A pause. A different pause than the others. Something in it, some slightly different quality. "I know the name," Talon said. Ronan waited. "There was a man who came into Sunridge about a year ago, maybe 14 months. He was driving a rental, the kind of rental that costs more than it should, and he had brake issues. Soft pedal, slight pull to the left. I looked at it." Talon's hands were back on the table, flat, the palms down listening posture reversed into something more like steadying. It wasn't the brakes. It was a lateral suspension component, a small wear issue on the right front control arm that was creating a handling characteristic that felt like brake pull under certain conditions. I fixed the actual problem. Ronan said nothing. 2 weeks later, the man's assistant called Sunridge and said the vehicle had experienced brake failure, said I'd missed a brake issue and created a safety situation. Talon's voice was steady, but there was something underneath the steadiness, a current, controlled the way he controlled everything. "My manager went to the footage from the shop camera. It showed exactly what I'd done and why. The manager filed a response to the liability claim with the footage and the documentation." "And?" "And the claim didn't go away," Talon said. "It just got quiet. Nobody came after the station directly, but our insurance rate went up the following quarter. And the station manager, Doyle, the guy who'd been there for 9 years, he was let go 4 months later. Budget reasons." He looked at Ronan. "I don't know if those things are connected. I just know the sequence." Ronan absorbed this. "The man who came in with the rental," he said. "Did he watch you work?" Something shifted in Talon's face. The specific quality of a memory being re-examined in a new light, familiar facts reorganizing into an unfamiliar pattern. "He did," Talon said slowly. "He stood at the bay door the whole time. I thought he was just impatient. Some people do that." "What did he look like?" 60 maybe, gray suit, expensive, the kind of calm that comes from being used to being the most important person in any room." A pause. "He asked me a question while I was working. He asked how I diagnosed it. I told him about the suspension component. He said..." Talon stopped. His expression changed. He said, "That's a sophisticated conclusion for a station mechanic? What did you say?" I said the vehicle told me. He didn't respond. He just looked at me. The diner radio shifted again. A news segment, something about weather systems coming down from Canada. Outside, through the frost-cleared window, one of the Iron Sentinel's Harleys pulled through the parking lot slowly and disappeared. "He was testing you," Ronan said. Talon looked at him. "Before the Iron Wraith. Before any of this." Ronan kept his voice even. "Someone sent a vehicle with a manufactured problem into a roadside station to see what the mechanic would do with it, to see if the mechanic would find the real problem or treat the symptom." Talon was very still. "And you found the real problem," Ronan said. "And someone noted that. And 14 months later, the Iron Wraith fails in front of 4,000 people in a national media presence, and an 18-year-old kid from Hartfield shows up and solves it in 40 minutes. And suddenly, the liability claim that's been sitting quiet gets activated." You think the brake complaint was staged, Talon said. I think it was insurance, Ronan said. Something to hold in reserve. The silence between them was a different quality now than it had been before. Ronan could see Talon processing, not panicking, processing, which was the discipline of a mind that had learned to navigate difficult information by taking it apart rather than reacting to its weight. The same discipline he'd brought to the Iron Wraith, applied now to the architecture of his own situation. Who is he, Ka? Talon said. Carlo. Someone who built a significant business on the principle that mechanical expertise is a scarce and credentialed resource, Ronan said, and who has reason to ensure it stays that way. Talon looked out the window. His jaw worked once. He picked up his coffee, cold now, probably, and drank from it anyway, the gesture automatic, something to do with his hands while his mind was somewhere else. I should go, he said. That's the wrong move. If I'm the problem, you're not the problem. You're the target. Those are different positions. Ronan leaned forward slightly. If you leave, the narrative belongs to whoever's telling it. You become the kid with the liability claim and the missing credentials and the broken employment record. The television story about the Iron Wraith becomes a footnote. The thing you actually did yesterday disappears into whatever version of events Carlo's attorneys decide to construct. He paused. You stay. You let the Brotherhood figure out what we're dealing with, and you trust the process. I don't know you, Talon said. The first direct version of the thing he'd been circling since yesterday. Not really. You've been good to me. But I don't know what the Iron Sentinels actually are. I don't know what your process costs. That's fair, Ronan said. Ask me anything. Has anyone who trusted your process ever gotten hurt because of it? The diner noise continued. The truckers laughed at something. The radio cycled back to music. Yes, Ronan said. Talon held the look. A man named Cruz, Ronan said. 7 years ago. We were helping him navigate a situation with a former employer. Wrongful termination. There was a retaliation component. We moved too fast in a direction we hadn't fully mapped, and it created a window that the other side used. Cruz spent 4 months in a legal situation that damaged him. Ronan's hands were flat on the table. He came out of it. He's in the Brotherhood now, in Bozeman. But the 4 months were real, and they cost him, and that's on me. Talon said nothing. I don't promise clean outcomes, Ronan said. I promise that every decision gets made with full information and the Brotherhood's full attention, and that whatever happens, you won't go through it alone. Outside, a second Harley came through the lot. Then a third. The Iron Sentinels were converging, doing it without being called, the way the Brotherhood sometimes did. Some distributed awareness that operated through means that nobody could fully explain, a collective nervous system built from 2 decades of riding together. Talon watched them through the window. His face was doing the thing it did when he was deciding, not visible in any obvious expression, but in the slight forward orientation of his attention, the way his eyes weren't unfocused, but weren't fixed either. Reading the whole system, not the parts. Okay, he said again. The same word as yesterday, but differently weighted. Marcus had information by 11 o'clock. He delivered it in the Roadhouse's back room with the door closed and 12 Iron Sentinels present, which was the full complement of the Brotherhood that had made the trip to Ironwood. He stood at the end of the pushed-together tables with a legal pad and his reading glasses, and the particular economy of a man who'd spent years producing intelligence briefings and had never fully unlearned the format. Talon sat at the far end. Ronan had brought him in without a vote, which he knew was itself a statement, and had made the decision to be the statement deliberately. Garrett was present. Briggs was present. Nobody said anything about Talon's presence, which was either acceptance or a silence that would cost something later. Marcus talked for 22 minutes. Crestfield Automotive Consulting, LLC, had been incorporated in Nevada 14 months ago, the same month as Talon's college acceptance letter, which was a coincidence that nobody noted aloud and that nobody in the room believed was a coincidence. Its registered agent was a law firm in Reno with no public profile. Its stated business purpose was automotive consulting and diagnostic services. It had active contracts with 6 insurance carriers and 4 regional fleet management companies, providing what its materials described as independent mechanical assessment services. Its actual function, as best Marcus had been able to determine through public filings, litigation records, and a few channels he didn't describe in detail, was to serve as the credentialed expert layer in insurance disputes, the entity that provided the diagnostic authority that determined whether a repair was valid, whether a claim was legitimate, whether a mechanic's work was competent or actionable. It appeared as the expert voice in 43 liability cases across its operating territory in the past 14 months. In 41 of those cases, the determination had favored the insurance carrier over the repair shop or individual mechanic. The Gerald Parr liability claim against Sunridge Auto Service was the only one in Montana. It was also, Marcus noted, the only one in Crestfield's portfolio that had been held in reserve for more than 8 months without resolution or withdrawal. That's not normal practice, Marcus said. You file a claim, you push it towards settlement, or you withdraw it. You don't hold it, unless you're using it as leverage for something that hasn't happened yet. The room was quiet. Carlo's connection to Crestfield, Briggs said. 6 layers of corporate structure, all legitimate on paper. Nothing that creates direct legal exposure for him personally. Marcus looked at his pad. But Crestfield's operating budget for the past 14 months includes a consulting retainer paid to a private advisory firm in Billings that lists Carlo as a senior advisor. Can you prove the connection publicly? Garrett said. Not at the level that matters in court. Not yet. What's he actually protecting? Another voice from the table. A man named Hendricks, former Army logistics officer, 2 years in the Brotherhood. Carlo's been in automotive consulting for what, 20 years? One kid fixing one bike. It's not the bike, Talon said. Every head in the room turned. It was the first time he'd spoken since Marcus had started talking. He was looking at the table, not at the room. His hands were around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. When he looked up, his expression was the same neutral composure he'd had in the repair tent. But underneath it, something was moving. Something that had been moving since Ronan had said the name Crestfield in the diner. What is it? Ronan said. My father, Talon said. Before the strokes, he was talking to someone about a licensing framework for small shop diagnostics, a certification model that would have allowed independent mechanics, small operations, roadside shops, to provide formally recognized diagnostic assessments without going through the major credentialing bodies. He paused. The credentialing bodies that Carlo's network has controlling relationships with. The room temperature changed. Not physically, the other way. He'd been building it for 3 years, Talon said. He had partnerships with 4 other shop owners in central Montana. He had a draft framework. He was talking to a state representative about a pilot program. His jaw worked. He had his first stroke in August of the year the proposal was filed with the state licensing board. His second stroke 14 months later. The proposal died with the business. Nobody spoke for a moment. You think Carlo knew your father, Ronan said. I think the man who came into Sunridge with the rental car wasn't there about a brake problem, Talon said. I think he came to see if the son was what the father had been. And when he confirmed it, he made sure the liability instrument was in place before I could become anything that mattered. The silence in the room had the specific texture of a dozen men recalibrating simultaneously. Not panic, not even anger yet, but the particular stillness of people who have just understood that a situation is larger and older and more deliberate than they'd been treating it. Garrett looked at Ronan. His expression was not "I told you so." It was something more complicated. The look of a man who'd been worried about exposure and had just discovered the exposure was worse than his worry, which wasn't the same as satisfaction. He didn't come after your father directly, Ronan said to Talon. No legal action, nothing visible. He didn't have to, Talon said. The strokes were the strokes, Ronan said. Yes, Talon said. And then, I think. The 2 words hung in the room. Ronan looked at Marcus. Marcus met the look with the face of a man who understood what was being asked and didn't yet have the answer. I'll dig, he said. But Ronan... He paused, choosing his phrasing carefully in the way that cautious men choose phrasing when the stakes are high. If there's anything there, it's buried in ways that took time and resources to bury. We're not going to find it in a day. We're not going to need a day, Ronan said. We're going to need a different approach entirely. He looked around the table, at Garrett, at Briggs, at Hendricks, at the faces of men he'd ridden beside for years. This isn't a legal situation anymore. Or it's not only a legal situation. He paused. Carlo used legitimate mechanisms to destroy a small shop operator's life's work. He used legitimate mechanisms to position a liability instrument over a kid before the kid could become a problem. And he's watching, right now, today, to see what we do next. Because the television story is still running. The Iron Wraith is still the story of the day. And if we announce any kind of association between Talon and the Iron Sentinels before we understand what Carlo's next move is, he activates the claim, Garrett said. And he has Sutton file a brief that links the Iron Sentinels to the liability, Ronan said. And suddenly, the vocational academy proposal, the fellowship, the whole structure, it's contaminated. Not by anything real, but by the appearance of association with an unresolved liability narrative. And the donors walk, and the state licensing partners walk, and the story becomes something else entirely. Briggs had his elbows on the table. He was looking at the surface of it. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking Carlo moved because he was startled," Ronan said. "He had a plan, and the plan didn't account for the event actually generating the specific attention it generated. He expected the bike story to stay regional. Instead, it went national, and the kid became a name. And Carlo activated the only instrument he had available, which means he acted fast, which means he acted imperfectly." He let that sit. "There's a gap," Marcus said, understanding arriving in his voice, "between what he can document and what actually happened. His story about the liability claim requires Gerald Parr," Ronan said. "A real person, a real complaint. Even if the claim was engineered, Parr is the face of it. And Parr is local. He's from Helena. He filed a complaint about a repair done at a station 40 miles from where he lives." Ronan looked at Marcus. "Find me Gerald Parr." The room shifted. Men moved, figuratively and literally. The posture of the Brotherhood changing around the tables as the meeting transformed from an information session into the beginning of something operational. Garrett was looking at the ceiling. Briggs had his arms crossed. Hendricks was writing something on the back of a napkin. Talon was watching Ronan. "You should know something," Ronan said to him. "What we're doing right now. What the Brotherhood is committing to. This isn't something we do for everyone. And it's not without cost. There will be men in this room who think we're moving too fast on information that's too thin. There will be men who think the connection to your father is a theory, not a fact. Those are valid positions." He paused. "I'm asking you to trust a process that's going to be imperfect and sometimes painful. The same way the Iron Wraith asked you to trust a diagnosis that required you to look at what nobody else was looking at." Talon held the look for a long moment. Then something happened that Ronan hadn't anticipated. Talon reached into his left jacket pocket, the pocket with the acceptance letter, and set the folded square of paper on the table in front of him. He didn't open it. He just set it there, like an object placed in evidence. "My father wrote that letter," he said. "I mean, he helped me write my application. He sat with me for 3 nights. He read every draft." His voice was steady, but the steadiness was doing a lot of work. "He never talked about the licensing proposal at home. He didn't want me to know how much he was invested in it until it was solid. I found out after the second stroke, going through his files to organize things for the facility." He looked at the letter. "He worked on both of them, the proposal and my application, at the same time. Different mornings, same kitchen table." No one in the room spoke. "Whatever happened to him," Talon said, "whether it was Carlo or just bad luck or just the way things go, he built something. He built a way of thinking in me that solved a problem yesterday that nobody else could solve, and he built a proposal that would have changed how small mechanics operate in this state." He looked up. "I'm not going anywhere, whatever it costs." It was Briggs who moved first. He unfolded his arms. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at Ronan. "What do you need from me?" he said, and then Garrett across the table, not looking at anyone in particular. "Same question." And then Hendricks, and then the others, each in their own voice, each carrying the particular weight of a man who'd already been through enough to know the difference between a decision and a commitment, and was making the second. What none of them heard, what nobody in that back room could have heard over the sound of their own voices and the ambient noise of the roadhouse and the Harleys idling out front, was the sound of a vehicle parking on the street outside. A sedan, dark blue, rental plates, the kind that costs more than it should. And what none of them saw was the man who got out of it. 60-something, gray suit, the particular calm of someone used to being the most important person in any room, who stood on the sidewalk outside the roadhouse for a moment and looked at the Harleys parked in front. He did not come inside. He took out his phone. He made a call that lasted 40 seconds. Then he got back in the vehicle. And when Decker came through the back room door 11 minutes later with his phone in his hand and his face wearing the expression it wore when the information was significant and bad, what he said was this: Gerald Parr had been found. He was at a motel in Ironwood. He'd been in Ironwood since Thursday, the day before the charity ride began. He had not come for the charity ride. He had come because someone had paid for his room and told him to be available, and Gerald Parr had not experienced brake failure. Gerald Parr had never owned a 2019 pickup truck. His name had been used without his knowledge, and when Marcus's contact had reached him by phone 20 minutes ago, Gerald Parr had been frightened in a way that suggested he understood, at least partially, what his name had been attached to. And he had said one thing before he'd ended the call. He'd said, "I already told them I wanted out. I told them in November." November. 3 months after Talon had repaired the vehicle. 3 months after someone had decided that the instrument was in place and the plan was running, and someone had kept the claim active anyway, without Gerald Parr's participation, which meant the liability claim was not just manufactured, it was fraudulent. And whoever had filed it knew that Parr had withdrawn his cooperation and had continued forward anyway, which meant they were operating on the assumption that Parr would stay quiet, that fear or money or some other mechanism would keep him from contradicting the official record. They had not anticipated that Ronan Mercer would find Gerald Parr in a motel in Ironwood, Montana, 48 hours after the Iron Wraith came back to life. They had not anticipated that Parr would pick up the phone. Ronan stood up from the table. "Where is he?" he said. Decker gave him the motel name. Ronan looked around the room, at Garrett, at Briggs, at the faces of men who had just heard the same information he had, and whose eyes were telling him what they'd decided about it before anyone said another word. "3 of us," Ronan said. "Any more and it's pressure. Any fewer, and we're not taking it seriously enough." He looked at Decker. "You, me, and me," Garrett said. Ronan looked at him. Garrett's jaw was set, and his eyes were direct, and he had the look of a man who'd been the cautious voice in every conversation for the past 24 hours, and had run out of reasons to keep being cautious. "I know what Carlo's type does to people who can't fight back," he said. "I've seen the end of that story before." A pause, something crossing his face that was old and specific and not for the room. "I'm going." "Talon," Ronan said. The boy looked at him. "You stay here. Briggs stays with you. Nobody comes or goes from this building until we're back." He paused. "Can you do that?" Talon looked at the acceptance letter still sitting on the table in front of him. He didn't pick it up. He left it there, in the middle of the pushed-together tables, surrounded by the coffee cups and napkins, and the residue of 22 minutes of information that had rewritten everything he thought he understood about the past 14 months of his life. "Yeah," he said. The 3 of them went out through the back. The cold hit immediately. Harder now than the morning, the temperature having dropped another 4 degrees while they were inside, the sky lower and darker and making a specific kind of promise about the afternoon. The Harleys started in sequence, the engines finding their rhythm, and the sound of them moved through the Ironwood streets and disappeared around the corner. Behind them, in the roadhouse, Briggs pulled his chair around to face the door and settled into it with the deliberate unhurry of a man who has decided where he is and intends to stay. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a cigarette and held it without lighting it, and Talon picked up the acceptance letter from the table. He unfolded it for the first time in front of another person. He read it, not because he didn't know what it said, but because some things need to be read in new light. In the light of what the past 24 hours had made them mean. He read it to the end, and then he folded it again, and he put it back in his pocket. "Tell me about the Billings property," he said to Briggs. "The one for the academy." Briggs looked at him for a moment. Something moved in the old man's face, something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite its opposite. "Old machine shop," Briggs said. "About 6,000 square feet. 3 bays, a classroom space that needs work, some storage. Good bones." He paused. "Why?" "Because if we're going to build something there," Talon said, "I want to understand the systems before anyone starts making decisions about the parts." Briggs held the unlit cigarette between 2 fingers and looked at the boy for a long, measuring moment. Then he put it behind his ear. "That's the right question," he said. Outside, the first snow of the afternoon began to fall, heavier than the morning's flurries, purposeful, the kind that settles and stays. It came down across the Ironwood streets and covered the tire tracks the Harleys had left, and kept. The Ironwood Sunset Motel sat at the eastern edge of town, where the main road stopped pretending to be a main road and became highway again. A single-story L-shaped building from the early 80s, with exterior corridors and a parking lot that needed resurfacing and a vacancy sign that had been missing the V for long enough that nobody remembered when it had been there. 12 rooms. A vending machine by the office that dispensed things nobody wanted. A single security camera above the office door pointed at the parking lot at an angle that covered approximately 40% of what it should have covered. Room 9 was at the far end of the L, corner position, the room that people requested when they wanted the most distance from the office and the road. Ronan knew this without being told, the same way he knew most things about how frightened people positioned themselves. He'd been a frightened person in enough unfamiliar places to understand the geometry of it. He pulled the Harley in at the far edge of the parking lot, engine down to idle, headlight off. Decker came in from the north side, along the fence line. Garrett took the road-facing approach, slow and wide, giving himself the sight line to both ends of the building. They cut engines simultaneously, without a signal. After 20 years, some things didn't need signals. The cold was absolute. The snow coming down in the particular windless way that means it intends to accumulate, straight down, steady, each flake taking its time. It had already covered the parking lot surface enough to show tracks, and Ronan read the tracks before he moved. 2 sets of tire marks entering, 1 leaving. The remaining vehicle was a dark blue sedan, rental plates, parked 2 spaces from room 9. He'd seen it before, on the street outside the roadhouse. Decker materialized at his left shoulder without sound, which was Decker's particular skill. "Blue sedan," Decker said, barely above a breath. "I see it. He came here after the roadhouse." "I know." Garrett appeared at the edge of the building, came toward them with the ground-eating stride of a man covering distance efficiently. His face was doing the thing it did in situations requiring controlled output. A compression around the eyes, jaw set, breathing measured. He'd been infantry. He'd never fully stopped being infantry. "1 vehicle," Garrett said. 1 set of boot prints from the sedan to room 9. Lights on inside, curtain pulled, gap at the bottom. "More than 1 person in there?" Ronan said. "Can't tell from outside." Ronan looked at the room. He looked at the sedan. He looked at the snow coming down between the parking lot lights and the way it erased evidence of presence as efficiently as intention. "Gerald Parr is in there," he said. "Whether Carlo's man is in there with him is the question." "Only one way," Decker said. Ronan walked to room 9. He didn't hurry. He didn't approach from an angle or position himself strategically, or do any of the things that would have announced that this was anything other than one man walking to a motel room door. The most disarming approach was always the direct one. He'd learned at the same place he'd learned most things, in situations where the wrong red cost more than he could afford to pay. He knocked. 3 beats. Even. The knock of someone with a reason to be there. Silence inside. Movement. The specific quality of stopped motion, the sound of a person who had been doing something and had ceased doing it upon hearing the knock. Then footsteps, light crossing toward the door. A pause at the door. The shadow of feet visible in the gap at the bottom. The person on the other side doing the same assessment Ronan was doing on this side. "Who is it?" a voice said. "Male. Older. the specific flatness of someone managing fear by compressing everything into a narrow register. "Ronan Mercer," Ronan said. A longer pause. The chain came off. The deadbolt turned. The door opened 4 inches and a face appeared in the gap. 60-something, heavy around the jaw, eyes that had been doing the arithmetic of a bad situation for long enough that the arithmetic showed. Gerald Parr looked at Ronan the way a man looks at something he'd been told was coming, but had hoped wouldn't arrive. "You found me fast," Parr said. "You weren't hidden," Ronan said. "You were waiting." Parr looked at him for another moment, then he opened the door. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and takeout containers, and the particular anxious sourness of a man who hadn't slept properly in several days. One lamp on, the overhead off, the light pooling amber in the corners and leaving the center of the room in relative shadow. A duffel bag on the bed, half packed or half unpacked, impossible to determine which. A laptop on the small desk, lid down. An ashtray with 4 cigarette ends in it, each smoked to the filter. Parr was alone. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the 3 men who'd come through the door. Ronan in front, Garrett to his left, Decker pulling the door closed behind them, with the expression of a man taking account. "3, he said. "I expected more." "More would have been a statement," Ronan said. "This is a conversation." "What if I don't want to have it?" "You picked up the phone earlier," Ronan said. "You said you wanted out in November. You've been in this motel room since Thursday and you haven't left." He looked at the man directly. "You want to have it." Parr's hands were between his knees, clasped. He looked at the floor for a moment. The floor was the institutional carpet of a motel that hadn't been renovated since the 90s, brown and geometric and deeply uninteresting, the kind of surface people look at when they're gathering themselves. "How much do you know?" Parr said. "Enough to have found you," Ronan said. "Not enough to move without you." Parr looked up. Something in the directness of that, the honest accounting of what Ronan did and didn't have, seemed to recalibrate the man's assessment. He'd been prepared for bluster, maybe, for leverage and threats. The straightforward version was disarming in a way that left him momentarily without a posture to occupy. "He told me it was a consulting job," Parr said. "Sutton's firm. They do legitimate liability work, some of it. I've done consulting for them before. 6 years ago, I was in an actual break situation, real one, and I consulted on the mechanical assessment. So I was in their database as someone with relevant experience." He pulled one hand free and rubbed it across his jaw. "Last year, they came to me with a file, said they needed a named complainant for a case involving a small station in Hartfield. Said the repair in question had genuine liability exposure, and they needed someone with a background in vehicle maintenance who could credibly claim to have experienced the issue." "You didn't experience any issue," Ronan said. "I never set foot in Hartfield." Parr's voice was flat. "They gave me a vehicle description, a repair date, a narrative, said it was for a coordinated liability action, that there were multiple claims being filed and they needed the Montana case to have a local face." He paused. "They paid me $4,000. The room was very quiet. "When did you find out what it was actually for?" Garrett said. His voice was controlled, but the control was doing work. "November," Parr said. "I started seeing the name Crestfield Automotive coming up in industry news. Not prominently, but if you knew what to look for. I'd done enough legitimate consulting to understand what a coordinated liability campaign looks like when it's aimed at suppressing competition. And the more I looked at the Hartfield case, at the kid whose name was in the file." He stopped. "I'm not a good man, but I'm not—" Another stop. "I called Sutton in November, told him I was withdrawing. He told me withdrawal wasn't a provision of my consulting agreement, that the claim would proceed with or without my active participation." "And you believed him," Ronan said. "He's right," Parr said. "I signed a document giving Sutton's firm discretionary authority to proceed on the claim on my behalf. Standard language in their consulting agreements. They said it was so they could handle minor procedural matters without requiring my availability for every step." His jaw tightened. "It was so they could proceed without my consent." Garrett made a sound that was barely a sound, something at the back of his throat, the compressed output of a man keeping a controlled response from becoming an uncontrolled one. "What's on the laptop?" Decker said. He was looking at the desk. Parr followed his gaze. A moment of something, decision, or the arrival at a decision that had been made before they knocked. He crossed to the desk, opened the laptop, turned it so they could see the screen. "Copies," he said. "Everything I was given. The original file, the vehicle documentation, the narrative script, the payment records, the consulting agreement." He looked at Ronan. "And the internal Crestfield communication that Sutton's assistant sent to me by mistake in September. She was supposed to forward it to a colleague. She sent it to my email instead." Ronan stepped forward and looked at the screen. The email was dated September 14th. It was addressed between two people whose names Ronan didn't recognize, but the CC line at the top of the chain included Vincent Carlo's personal email address. The body of the message discussed the Ironwood charity ride, booked by name months before the event, in the context of what it called the Mercer demonstration. It discussed the Iron Wraith. It discussed a diagnostic outcome probability assessment, and it included a sentence near the bottom of the chain that sat in Ronan's chest like something with weight. "If the Mercer machine performs as projected, the Hartfield asset will require immediate activation. Confirm PAR file is ready for proceeding." "The Hartfield asset," Ronan said. His voice was completely even. "The kid," Parr said. That's how they referred to him in their internal documents. He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with guilt. They knew about him. They'd been tracking him since the rental car visit. They expected he might surface at the charity event because someone, I don't know who, someone in their network, had flagged that he'd been asking questions at the venue about the Iron Wraith failure. "He came on his own," Decker said. "I know," Parr said, "but they had a profile on him, and they had the Sunridge liability claim ready. And when he did what he did yesterday," he gestured at the laptop. "I've been in this room since Sunday night. I watched it on the news at the bar across the street, and I thought about my $4,000 and the document I signed and the kid in the gas station jacket, and He stopped. "I kept the email." Ronan straightened up from the laptop. He looked at Gerald Parr, at the large, heavy-jawed, poorly sleeping man sitting on the edge of a motel bed in Ironwood, Montana, who had taken $4,000 to be a name on a piece of paper and had ended up here, in this room, with this laptop, having answered a phone call from a stranger. "We need the documents," Ronan said, "all of them, and we need you to be willing to provide a sworn statement about the consulting engagement, the withdrawal, and the email." Parr looked at the floor again. "Sutton's firm will come after me." "Yes," Ronan said. "The consulting agreement is fraudulent on its face," Ronan said. "You can't grant discretionary authority to proceed on a false claim. The document is only valid if the underlying claim is valid, and it isn't." He paused. "We have an attorney, a good one. She's handled situations like this before. The IRS call it manufactured liability suppression. It has a formal definition and a specific set of remedies. You won't be standing alone in this." Parr looked at him for a long time. The lamp in the corner hummed slightly. Snow hit the window in the occasional gust and made a sound like sand. "The kid," Parr said. "Talon." "Yes." "Is he—" A pause. "Is he going to be okay?" "That's what we're here to determine," Ronan said. Parr nodded. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, draped over the back of the desk chair, and produced a USB drive. He held it out. "Full copies," he said, "including the email." Ronan took it. Then Decker's phone went off. Not a call, a text, which was the signal they'd established before leaving the roadhouse for situations requiring immediate attention without verbal communication. Decker read it. His face, which was already arranged for a difficult situation, arranged itself differently, tighter around the eyes, the jaw moving once. He showed the screen to Ronan. The text was from Briggs. 4 words. "Sutton's here. Roadhouse. Now." Ronan looked at the text. He looked at the USB drive in his hand. He looked at Gerald Parr. "Stay in this room," he said. "Do not open the door for anyone except the men who came through it tonight. Do not use your phone except to call the number Decker's going to give you." He was already moving toward the door. We'll be back. They went out into the snow at a pace that was not a run, and was everything a run was in intention, crossing the parking lot to the bikes with the ground-eating stride of men whose bodies remembered urgency from context that made this one feel familiar. Engines caught, all three, nearly simultaneous, and the sound of them in the empty motel parking lot was enormous in the cold air, reverberating off the building faces, rolling out across the snow-covered lot and into the dark. Garrett pulled alongside Ronan as they hit the road. He didn't shout over the engines. He looked at Ronan, and the look said what it needed to say. Whatever was at the roadhouse, whatever Sutton had come to do, they were riding toward it with no more preparation than what they had in their hands and on their backs, and in 20 years of understanding what it meant to protect something that mattered. Ronan opened the throttle. The Harleys hit the Ironwood Main Street doing 50 in a 30 zone, and nobody saw a reason to be slower. The roadhouse parking lot was arranged differently than they'd left it. 3 vehicles Ronan didn't recognize, all dark sedans, all rental plates, all parked with the nosed-in precision of people who expected to leave quickly. Ronan read this in the 2 seconds before he cut his engine, read it the way he read everything, as information about intention rather than accident. He was off the bike before it finished rocking. Through the roadhouse's front window, visible through the glass and the neon bar signs that gave everything inside a red-blue tint, Ronan could see the configuration of the back room, the pushed-together tables, the iron sentinels still positioned around them, and at the near end standing, a man in a gray suit whose posture communicated the calm of someone accustomed to rooms that rearranged themselves around his presence. And at the far end of the table, still seated, still with his palms flat on the surface, Talon. Ronan went through the front door. The bar noise dropped immediately, not because anyone called for quiet, but because the specific quality of Ronan Mercer entering a room at that pace, at that temperature, communicated something that rooms understood before people did. The bartender stepped back from the counter. 2 of the regular patrons near the door relocated their drinks and themselves without being asked. Ronan walked through the bar and into the back room, and the door swung shut behind him. The man in the gray suit turned. He was not Vincent Carlo. He was a decade younger, 50, trim, the kind of fit that comes from the specific vanity of men who need to feel physically capable even when their profession is entirely cerebral. His face had the quality of expensive dental work and regular sleep, the unmarked smoothness of a life without manual labor. He had the kind of eyes that assessed continuously, the professional habit of a man whose entire value was in reading rooms accurately. Sutton. "Mr. Mercer," he said, the same precise pleasantness Decker had described on the phone. "I apologize for the intrusion. I hoped we might speak." "You're speaking to my people without me present," Ronan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I arrived, and your people were generous enough to allow me to wait." He glanced around the room, at the iron sentinels positioned around the tables, at Briggs against the wall with his arms folded, at Garrett and Decker who'd come in behind Ronan and taken their positions with the unconscious precision of men who'd done this before. "I prefer to resolve things before they become complicated." "They're already complicated," Ronan said. "They don't have to be." Sutton turned to face him directly, the movement deliberate and unhurried. "The liability claim against Sunridge Auto Service is a legitimate legal instrument. The consulting agreement that supports it is properly executed. Whatever." He paused, a slight recalibration, the word chosen carefully. "Enthusiasm you've brought to the past few hours. Nothing you've found changes the legal reality of those documents." "Gerald Parr withdrew his participation in November," Ronan said. Something moved in Sutton's eyes. Small, controlled, but it moved. "Mr. Parr's consulting agreement is fraudulent," Ronan said, "because the underlying claim is fraudulent. Because Gerald Parr never owned a 2019 pickup truck and never set foot in Hartfield, and you know that, and you proceeded with the claim anyway after he withdrew, which makes this manufactured liability suppression under federal statute." He paused. "And we have documentation." The room was absolutely quiet. Sutton looked at Ronan for a long moment. He was good at this, at the composed response to unexpected information, at the face that didn't give away the recalculation happening behind it. but he was not better at it than Ronan was at reading it. And what Ronan read in the 2 seconds of controlled non-response was this. Sutton hadn't known about the email. He hadn't known that his assistant had sent it to Parr. He'd known Parr had the original documents, which was manageable, a frightened man's leverage, easily neutralized. He hadn't known about the CC line with Carlo's address. He hadn't known they had the chain. "Whatever you believe you have," Sutton said, "I'd encourage you to consider what happens when you make it public without understanding the full Talon," Ronan said. The boy looked at him from the far end of the table. "Stand up," Ronan said. Talon stood. "Look at this man," Ronan said. "Tell me what you see." Talon looked at Sutton with the same lateral attention he'd brought to the Iron Wraith, not at the surface, at the system. He looked at the suit and the posture and the careful eyes and the way Sutton's weight was distributed, slightly forward, the posture of a man preparing to redirect. "He came to see what we have," Talon said, "not to offer anything, to assess." Sutton's composure held, barely. "He's right," Garrett said from the wall. His voice was the particular flat tone of a man who has been angry for a long time at something too large to address and has just found a specific version of it to direct the anger toward. "You didn't come to resolve anything. You came to determine whether we're bluffing." "And we're not," Decker said. Sutton looked at Ronan. The pleasantness was still there, technically. The face hadn't fully abandoned the expression it had worn coming in, but something underneath it had shifted, the way ice shifts when the temperature underneath it changes, the surface holding while the structure adjusts. "What do you want?" he said. "The claim dropped," Ronan said. "Tonight. In writing, delivered to Sunridge Auto Service and copied to our attorney. Full withdrawal, no conditions, no refiling." He paused. "And a meeting with Carlo. Mr. Carlo has no formal I have an email with his address in the CC line discussing Talon Creed as a Hartfield asset and the activation of your claim as a response to the Ironwood event," Ronan said. "We both know what that means legally, so let's not waste time on formal associations." The silence stretched. Outside, through the roadhouse walls, the sound of the remaining Harleys in the parking lot, engines idling, the iron sentinels who'd stayed with the bikes maintaining their presence. The sound of it, a low, constant pressure in the room, the bass note underneath everything being said. Sutton reached into his jacket. Every person in the room moved in some small way. Not dramatically, but the collective attention sharpened to a point. He produced his phone. He looked at the screen. He made a call that lasted 11 seconds, in which he said nothing identifiable, and then he put the phone away. "Mr. Carlo will see you," Sutton said. "Tomorrow morning." "Tonight," Ronan said. Another pause. Another phone. Another 11-second call. "Tonight," Sutton confirmed. Ronan looked at the man, at the gray suit and the expensive calm and the eyes that had been assessing and recalculating since the moment Ronan walked through the door. He looked at him the way he'd looked at the Iron Wraith on the morning it failed, not with fury, not with grief, but with the specific focused attention of a man who understood that the problem in front of him was a system, and that systems could be read, and that what looked like impenetrable complexity was, somewhere underneath it, a set of relationships that spoke to each other in patterns that could be traced. "Leave first," Ronan said. "We'll follow." Sutton left. The room exhaled. Garrett crossed to Ronan's side in 3 strides. "You sure about this?" he said, low, just to him. "Walking into a room with Carlo tonight, with what we have, we won't be walking into his room," Ronan said. "He'll be walking into ours." He looked at Garrett. "Find me a space. Somewhere we control the geometry." Garrett understood immediately. He pulled out his phone. Briggs appeared at Ronan's shoulder. He looked older in the neon light of the back room. Not diminished, but more fully himself, the age and the weight of it visible in a way that the daytime didn't always reveal. He put a hand briefly on Ronan's arm, a contact that lasted 2 seconds and communicated a decade's worth of position. "You've got the documents," Briggs said. "We've got the documents," Ronan said. "You've got the email." "Yes." Briggs nodded. He took his hand back. "Then the rest is just people in a room," he said. And we've been in rooms before. Talon was standing at the end of the table. He hadn't moved since Ronan had asked him to stand. He was watching the room with the expression of a man who is trying to understand the full system of what he's been brought into. Not frightened, but comprehending, the specific quality of a mind encountering the actual scale of a thing for the first time. Ronan went to him. "You're coming," Ronan said. "I need you to understand. You're not there as a witness. You're there because this is about you, and you have the right to be in the room where it gets decided. And because Carlo needs to see the thing he's been trying to suppress." He paused. "Can you handle that?" Talon looked at him. His gray eyes had the quality of the Montana sky in the particular hour before weather. Clear, but loaded, holding something that was going to come down. "My father built something for 3 years, Talon said. At a kitchen table, in the mornings, before the garage opened. And someone looked at it and decided it needed to disappear." His voice was completely steady. "Yeah," he said. "I can handle the room." The meeting was arranged for 11 that night at a space Garrett had sourced, an old commercial garage 3 blocks off Main Street that one of the Iron Sentinel's contacts used for winter storage. 6,000 square feet of concrete floor and bare metal walls, and the smell of oil and cold that Talon would have recognized as the smell of his father's place, scaled up. 4 standing work lights, the kind that run on wheeled stands, positioned to light the center and leave the perimeter in relative shadow. The Iron Sentinel's bikes were parked outside in a line that wasn't a threat display and communicated threat through its sheer completeness. Every machine present, every man accounted for. Carlo arrived at 11:04. He came with Sutton and 2 other men whose function was visible in the way they positioned themselves, flanking, slightly back, eyes on the room rather than the conversation. Security, or the version of security that men like Carlo employed, presence as statement rather than capability. He was exactly as Talon had described. 60-something. Gray suit that cost more than most men's monthly income. The calm of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. He walked into the garage and looked at the Iron Sentinels arranged in the space, and he looked at Ronan, and he looked, last, at Talon. And in the half-second that his eyes were on the boy, something moved in his face that he controlled immediately, but that Ronan caught, because Ronan had been watching for it. Not guilt. Something older and more complicated. The expression of a man who has been certain of a threat and has just confirmed the threat is exactly what he assessed it to be, which is its own version of fear. "Mr. Mercer," Carlo said. The voice was measured, resonant, the voice of a man who had learned to speak in rooms larger than this one. "Sit down," Ronan said. There were no chairs. Carlo understood the statement. He stopped where he was, 8 feet from Ronan, and they stood in the working light of the portable lamps with the smell of oil and cold between them, and the low, distant sound of the remaining ironwood traffic outside, and the complete silence of 12 Iron Sentinels holding the perimeter. "You know why we're here," Ronan said. "I know what you believe you have," Carlo said. "Then let me save time." Ronan looked at him without expression. "The email. September 14th. Your address in the CC line. The language about the Hartfield asset and the Ironwood event." He paused. "We have it. Our attorney has a copy. A second copy is with a journalist at the Montana Tribune who is currently deciding whether to file a public records request for Crestfield Automotive state licensing documents." Carlo said nothing. His face was doing the contained recalculation, better at it than Sutton, more practiced, the work happening entirely behind the eyes. "Your network suppressed a state licensing proposal from a small shop operator in Hartfield 3 years ago," Ronan said. "You used coordinated pressure. We don't have the mechanism yet, but we'll find it, and now that we know where to look, it won't take long. You used a fraudulent liability instrument to position yourself against his son when his son became visible." He paused. "And you sent a man to test that son 14 months ago in a rental car with a manufactured brake complaint because you wanted to know if the son was what the father had been." The garage was very quiet. "He is," Ronan said. "You know that. You've known it since he fixed the Iron Wraith. That's why you activated the claim. That's why Sutton was in my roadhouse tonight." He looked at Carlo directly. You built a system to protect the value of credentialed expertise. And an 18-year-old kid with no credentials and a gas station uniform walked through your system in 40 minutes and proved it was built on a foundation that couldn't withstand a different way of thinking. Carlo looked at Talon. And Talon, 18 years old, Sunridge jacket under the Iron Sentinel's hoodie, acceptance letter in his left pocket, looked back at him with the lateral, systems-reading attention that he'd brought to every problem he'd ever been given, and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, because the looking was enough, because the looking was exactly what Carlo had spent 14 months and considerable resources trying to prevent. "What do you want?" Carlo said. The question was directed at Ronan, but his eyes were still on the boy. Ronan opened his mouth to answer, and that was when this garage's side door, the one that none of them had been watching, because it was on the perimeter, and the perimeter was held, opened from the outside, admitting a gust of cold air and snow and the sound of a car engine cutting off. And a man came through it who was not one of the Iron Sentinels, and not one of Carlo's people, and whose face, when the working light caught it, Ronan had never. The man who came through the side door was 64 years old and moved like someone who had recently relearned how to walk. Careful, deliberate, each step a small decision rather than an automatic one. He wore a flannel shirt under an unzipped canvas jacket, and his hair was white at the temples and gray everywhere else, and his left hand gripped the doorframe for a moment after he came through it, steadying himself against the cold and the transition from dark to working light. His eyes found Talon first. They always did, apparently. Even now, even after everything, even with 12 Iron Sentinels and Vincent Carlo and the weight of an entire unresolved night in the garage, his eyes went to his son first, the same way water finds the lowest point without being told to. Talon made a sound that was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they had restructured their entire internal life around the absence of walks back into a room. Not a cry, not a name, something more fundamental than either. The specific, involuntary vocalization of a nervous system encountering the impossible and having no prepared response for it. "Dad," he said. And then he said nothing else. Because there was nothing else. Because the word contained everything. And the everything was too large for the room, and too large for language, and too large for anything except the crossing of distance, which Talon did, closing the 15 feet between them in the particular way of young men who have been trying to be composed and have run out of reason to continue. And Elias Creed, who had survived 2 strokes and a care facility in Hartfield and 38 hours of a car ride that Marcus had arranged without telling anyone except Briggs, put both arms around his son and held on. Nobody in the garage spoke. Ronan looked at Carlo. Carlo was watching the two of them, the old mechanic and the boy, with the specific expression of a man confronting evidence that cannot be recategorized. Not guilt, not remorse, exactly. Something older and quieter and more corroding than either. The expression of a man who built a system to suppress a thing and is now watching the thing exist anyway, in its full human form, in a garage in Ironwood, Montana, at 11 o'clock at night, in front of witnesses. "He's been having good weeks," Briggs said quietly, appearing at Ronan's left shoulder. "Marcus found out 2 weeks ago. Didn't want to say anything until we knew if it would hold." A pause. "It's holding." Ronan looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the floor. "I know," he said. "I should have told you." "Yeah," Ronan said. "You should have." They stood together in that for a moment. The oldest argument the Brotherhood ever had. The one between moving fast and moving carefully. The one that never fully resolved because both positions were right and wrong in different proportions depending on the day. Then Ronan put his hand briefly on Briggs's shoulder, a 2-second contact, the same gesture Briggs had used on him 2 hours ago, filed, settled, moving forward. He turned back to Carlo. "The withdrawal," Ronan said. "The Sunridge claim. Tonight." Carlo looked at him. The gray suit looked different in the garage light than it had when he'd walked in. Not diminished, but contextually displaced. The wrong material for the room, a costume for a different kind of space. "My attorneys will require—" "Sutton," Ronan said, without raising his voice. Sutton, who had been standing at the garage's edge with the particular stillness of a man running continuous damage assessment, looked up. "Draft the withdrawal," Ronan said. "Right now, on your phone. Email it to our attorney and copy Sunridge Auto Service directly. He paused. Or we send the email, and the Montana Tribune's contact gets a call. Sutton looked at Carlo. Carlo looked at Ronan for a long moment. He was doing the system read, the same thing everyone in this garage did when they were deciding, looking at the whole, not the parts, tracing the relationships between things. He was good at it. He'd built a significant life on it. But the problem with being good at reading systems was that it also showed you clearly when a system had already moved past the point where your intervention would change the outcome. He nodded once. Sutton took out his phone. The withdrawal was drafted in 7 minutes and sent in 8. Ronan's attorney confirmed receipt at 11:22 and responded in 3 words. On it. Good. Ronan read the confirmation on his own phone and put it in his jacket pocket and did not show the exhale that moved through his chest, because some things were for later and private when the room didn't need him to be the fixed point. What happened next happened slowly, which was right. Carlo and his people left without ceremony. Sutton first, then the 2 flanking men, then Carlo himself, who paused at the garage door and turned back and looked at the room one final time. His eyes moved across the iron sentinels, across Ronan, and stopped briefly on Talon and Elias, still standing together near the side entrance, Talon's hand on his father's arm in the particular grip of someone making sure the thing in front of them is real. Carlo said nothing. He turned and walked out into the ironwood night, and the sound of his vehicles leaving was swallowed quickly by the cold and the snow and the silence of a town that had gone to sleep around everything that had happened inside it. The garage began to breathe differently. Marcus came in through the side door. He'd been outside with Elias, had driven him up from the care facility in Hartfield himself, 12 hours round trip in a borrowed truck that smelled like pine air freshener and old upholstery. He looked tired in the particular way of a man who has spent 12 hours doing something emotionally significant while presenting as logistical. He found Ronan's eyes across the room and gave one small nod, the minimal communication of a man reporting mission complete. Ronan mouthed 2 words at him. Thank you. Marcus looked away, which was how he accepted things. Garrett was sitting on the edge of a workbench at the garage's far wall, elbows on his knees, hands loose between them. He'd been in motion for 14 hours and the stoppage showed, not weakness, the specific gravity of a man whose body had been running on operational focus and was now recalibrating to the absence of immediate threat. Ronan went to him. They sat together for a moment without speaking, which was a language they'd developed over 11 years and which said, in this instance, we're still here. The thing is done. The cost was real. We'll count it later. You were right, Garrett said finally. About the kid. You were right too, Ronan said. About moving carefully. Both things, Garrett said. Both things. Garrett looked across the garage at Talon and Elias. Something moved in his face. Old, specific. The quality of a man looking at a particular shape of story and recognizing it from the inside. He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. What happens to the old man? He said. There's a specialist in Billings who's been getting results with post-stroke cognitive recovery, Ronan said. Marcus found him 3 weeks ago. The care facility in Hartfield agreed to a transfer. He paused. We'll cover the difference in cost. Garrett looked at him. Brotherhood decision, Ronan said. We voted while you were watching the parking lot. Garrett was quiet for a moment. When did you vote? Before we left for the motel, Ronan said. Briggs called it. Unanimous. Garrett looked at the floor. He pressed his lips together once, a brief compression. Okay, he said. They sat in the quiet of that for a while longer. Around them, the garage began to organize itself toward departure, the iron sentinels moving in the unhurried, coordinated way of men who'd learned to break down a position together, the work lights being repositioned, jackets zipped, the accumulated weight of the night being shouldered back into portable form. It was nearly midnight when they came out into the ironwood cold, and the snow had stopped, and the sky above the town was the particular clear darkness that follows a storm. Every star present, air scrubbed clean, the temperature having dropped another 3 degrees into something that required respect. The Harleys sat in their line along the garage exterior, frost-dusted and patient. and starting them in sequence produced a sound that rolled down the empty main street and came back off the storefronts as something larger than itself. Talon and Elias came out last. Elias moved carefully, Talon one step to his left and slightly behind, not guiding, present. The posture of someone who had learned in the past several hours that presence was the thing, the specific and irreplaceable act of being close enough to reach. Elias looked at the line of motorcycles with the unhurried attention of an old mechanic confronting machines that interested him, reading them with the same lateral attention his son had demonstrated in the repair tent, the genetic inheritance of a way of seeing. "Nice line," Elias said. His voice was slightly slower than it should have been, the stroke's residue in the processing, but the attention was there, the eye was there, the thing that mattered was entirely present. Decker, standing beside his bike, looked at the old man and said, 1978 to 2019. Every decade represented. Elias moved slightly down the line. He stopped at one machine, Briggs's, a modified 1989 Softail with a rebuilt primary that Briggs had been working on for 6 years. He looked at it. He crouched slightly, the movement careful, knees that had been through a lot. "Primary chains running tight," he said. Briggs, lighting a cigarette 3 feet away, stopped with the lighter halfway to his face. He looked at the machine. He looked at Elias. He looked at Talon. Talon said nothing. He was watching his father's face with the expression of a man storing something, not photographing, storing, the deep cellular keeping of a moment that he'd stopped letting himself expect to have again. "I'll look at it in the morning," Briggs said. His voice was rougher than usual. Elias straightened back up. He looked at the clear sky. He put his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. "Cold," he said contentedly, in the voice of a man for whom cold air is simply weather and weather is simply the world being itself. "Yeah," Talon said. They stood together under the ironwood stars, father and son, with the iron sentinels around them in the particular loose formation that wasn't protective and was entirely protective, the geometry of a found family doing the thing it did without naming it, present, proximate, available. Ronan stood at the end of the line. He looked at the iron wraith which Decker had brought up from the charity venue on the trailer that afternoon, which was parked now at the garage's exterior wall with a tarp over it that the snow had dusted white. He looked at it the way he'd looked at it the morning it failed, but differently, because looking at something from the other side of a significant thing changes what you see, changes the light that falls on it, changes what the object means inside the story you're telling yourself about it. It was not a perfect machine. He understood that differently now. It was a machine built with full competence and full knowledge by a man who had not traced every downstream consequence of every decision, and it had failed in front of 4,000 people, and an 18-year-old kid with grease in his knuckle creases had crouched beside it and looked at what it was telling him and found the language hidden in the relationships between things. The Iron Wraith had not been saved. It had been understood. Those were different things. He was still learning that they were different things. He heard boots on the frost-dusted concrete beside him and knew the footfall before he turned. Talon stood next to him, looking at the tarped machine. He had both hands in the front pocket of the Iron Sentinel's hoodie. He looked the same as he'd looked in the diner that morning. Gray eyes, that particular quality of attention, the face of a young man who has been carrying something enormous and has learned not to show the weight of it in his posture. Except something was different now. Something around the eyes, a fractional loosening, the specific quality of a person for whom a long-held tension has released far enough that the body doesn't know yet what to do with the space. "My father," Talon said. He remembered the application. He remembered every draft. Ronan didn't say anything. He said, Talon stopped. Started again, more carefully. "The way you carry something fragile." He said he always knew I'd fix something that mattered. He just thought it would be an engine. A pause. I told him it was an engine. Ronan looked at the tarp, at the outline of the Iron Wraith underneath it, familiar as his own hands. "Engineering school starts in September," Ronan said. "The Billings property has a project manager starting in February. The academy curriculum needs to be designed by someone who understands the difference between looking for broken parts and looking for broken relationships. He paused. That leaves you 6 months, which is tight. Talon was quiet for a moment. I'll need the shop specs, he said, for the Billings property, bay dimensions, electrical capacity, existing infrastructure. Marcus has them. And I'll need access to the Iron Wraith, Talon said, not to fix anything, to use it as a teaching model, to show students how every system in a machine speaks to every other system. He looked at the tarp. It's the best example I've ever seen of what happens when you stop listening to those conversations. Ronan looked at him. It's yours, Ronan said. Talon turned to look at him. His face, in the cold, clear night, in the aftermath of everything the past 48 hours had cost and built and broken and made, held the particular expression of a person receiving something they had not known they needed and therefore had not known to ask for. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a thing seriously, understanding its weight, intending to be worth it. Behind them, the iron sentinels were mounting up, the sequence of engines starting in 2s and 3s, the sound building into the collective low thunder of the Brotherhood in motion, rolling through Ironwood's emptied Main Street and into the dark of the Montana Highway, heading west toward Billings and the ordinary lives that waited there, the garages and the kitchens and the particular quiet of men who had done something that mattered and would not discuss it in any form that required an audience. Decker idled past and looked at Ronan with an expression that communicated everything necessary in the space between 1 second and the next. Garrett rode past without looking, which was Garrett's way of saying he was okay, that things were okay, that the morning would be ordinary, and that ordinary was a form of victory that he'd stopped undervaluing. Briggs went last, as he always did, the old softail moving with its slightly too tight primary chain, singing a note that Elias Creed had heard from 10 feet away in the dark, and identified with the attention of a man whose ears had spent 50 years learning the language of machines. Briggs raised 2 fingers off the handlebar as he passed, the road greeting, the minimal acknowledgement that said, I'm here, you're here, we made it through. Ronan raised 2 fingers back. Then it was just the 2 of them, Ronan and Talon, standing beside the Iron Wraith in the silent cold, with the last engine sounds fading west and the stars overhead doing what stars do, which is shine without requiring anything in return. You need a ride somewhere, Ronan said. Talon looked toward the motel down the road where Gerald Parr was presumably still sitting in room 9, with his laptop and his bad conscience, and the slow working through of a man who'd made a poor decision and had been given the unexpected chance to make a different one. I should check on Parr, Talon said. Make sure he knows what happened. Marcus will handle Parr, Ronan said. He's good with people who need to understand they're no longer in danger. Talon absorbed this. He looked at the highway, the empty westbound lane disappearing into the dark and the distance, the way all roads eventually disappeared into the thing waiting on the other side of the horizon. I want to see my father settled first, he said. At the new facility, make sure he knows where he is. Make sure he's not a stop. He doesn't do well with unfamiliar spaces sometimes. He needs someone there. We'll get him settled, Ronan said. You'll be there. Talon looked at him. We, he said. We, Ronan said. They stood in the cold a moment longer, the weight of the word hanging between them in the clear Montana air, simple and enormous in the way that simple things are when they've been earned at cost. The word that meant, not alone, not anymore. The structure is here and it will hold, and the thing you've been carrying since the garage in Hartfield and the kitchen table and the folded letter in your pocket can be set down now, incrementally, in the presence of people who have chosen to be present. Talon reached into his left jacket pocket. He took out the acceptance letter. He held it for a moment. The folded square with its worn crease lines, the paper that had been opened and closed 100 times in the dark, in the truck cab, in the Sunridge bathroom before shifts, every reading a private negotiation between the person he was and the person his father had believed he could become. He unfolded it all the way. He looked at it in the starlight, not reading it because he knew every word, but looking at it the way you look at something you are finally holding in the right light. Then he folded it again. Clean folds. Decisive. A different quality than the worn automatic folding of the past 14 months. He put it back in his pocket, not discarding it, carrying it forward, on different terms. September, Talon said. September, Ronan confirmed. The iron wraith sat under its tarp in the ironwood cold, patient as everything that has already survived what was supposed to stop it. Down the empty main street, a single diner window glowed amber. The early morning shift beginning, coffee going on, the first ordinary hour of a day that didn't know what the night before it had contained. Somewhere in the kitchen, a radio was probably playing. Somewhere, a pair of boots was crossing a linoleum floor. Somewhere, the smell of coffee was rising into the cold air above a town that was waking up to a version of itself that didn't look different from the outside, but had been changed in ways that would take years to fully measure. Ronan turned up his collar. He looked west, where the last of the Harley sounds had long since disappeared, where the highway ran straight and dark toward Billings, and the property outside it where, in some months, the first students would walk into a space designed to teach them that the most important thing a mechanic can learn is not how to find what's broken, but how to listen to what the system is trying to say. He started walking toward his bike. Talon fell into step beside him. They walked without hurry, two people in the cold dark of an early Montana morning, one older and one young, both carrying the specific gravity of men who have been through something and are not yet done being changed by it. The frost on the concrete caught the starlight and held it in small points, and their breath came out in slow clouds and disappeared, and somewhere in the distance, one final engine sound rose briefly and was gone. The iron wraith waited. The road waited. The morning was almost here.